Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I am Larissa Picard, Director of Pejepscot History Center, and very pleased to have you all join us for this program this evening. This is our first Zoom program of 2026, and one of our first programs for the year altogether. We kicked off our annual theme a couple weeks ago with a fabulous presentation by Colin Woodard at a sold-out event. And we are now well into our theme for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. What better way really to start out than by getting a taste of some regional revolutionary collections, which is what we have called this program tonight. We're going to look at sort of concentric circles of collections that start wide and then narrow into our region and our specific towns. So we will first be looking at collections from Massachusetts Historical Society, based in Boston, which is the oldest historical society in the country. Maine, of course, was part of Massachusetts, and Massachusetts was at the heart of the Revolution. And that will be presented by the chief historian and PHC trustee, Kanisorn Wongsrichanalai. After that, we'll be moving to the Maine Historical Society and looking at some state treasures. That'll be presented by Kathleen Neumann, Curator of Education and Public Programs. And then we will end with some gems from our own Pejepscot History Center collection from the 1776 era. And that will be presented by Robin Davis, who is our Manager of Collections and Research. Each of our three panelists are going to share their highlights in turn, and then after that, we will open it up for questions. I'll be handling the tech side of things and introducing our panelists as we go. Again, we'll save some time for Q&A. If you would like to drop a question into the chat box before the end of the program, that would be great, and I can help moderate those questions at the end. Before we start and I introduce Kanisorn a little bit more, I want to just mention some upcoming other programs that PHC has for you under the theme of Life and Liberty, the Ideals of Independence. We are starting a really exciting 4-session program on March 26th. This is called Coffee House Conversations. It is designed and developed by Sarah Sharpton, our outreach manager. It's going to take place in 4 coffee house businesses around Brunswick and Topsham. The first one is on the 26th at 11 a.m. at Gelato Fiasco, and people will, you get a ticket, you get a free drink, and it will be a discussion, a very facilitated but casual discussion about a excerpt from an important document, a founding document or a document that was important to the revolution. So that's really exciting. On March 28th, we have a colonial tea in the Schofield Whittier House. Our first session of that is sold out. So the 3:30 session has a few slots in it, I think. April 2nd on another Zoom program, Jim St. Pierre will be talking about Seth Eastman, who was Brunswick born. He went west and did paintings, became quite famous for doing paintings of Western life and Indian life, and later returned to Brunswick, and he has a very fascinating wife as well. So that'll be exciting. April 30th, we have a Topsham Library program co-hosted with them by Doug Bennett, who lives in Brigadier General Samuel Thompson's house on Elm Street. And he will be telling us all about that very famous revolutionary character and rabble-rouser. And then we, Pejepscot History Center, is opening our exhibit called Iterations of Independence, or at least that's the working title, on May 29. So all of that information is on our website, pejepscothistorical.org. So I invite you to check it out and join us for more programs. All right, let's get started with the fun stuff. We will start with Massachusetts Historical Society. Kanisorn is Mass Historical's Peter Drummey chief historian and a Bowdoin College alum, so he's a local boy in that sense. He has a PhD from the University of Virginia and taught at East Tennessee State and Angelo State University before arriving at Massachusetts Historical in 2019. He has 2 books to his credit and has been a PHC trustee since 2022, the year after he was our inaugural speaker for the Chamberlain Legacy Lecture. So I will turn it over to him and we will bring up his slideshow here to get started.
Thank you very much, Larissa. While you're finding the first slide there, I will just say it's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank everyone for taking a little bit of time to talk about American history this evening. I think I want to make one slight correction to Larissa's introduction. We prefer to be the first historical society in the nation rather than the oldest one. But yes, we are founded in 1791. And we have about 14 million manuscript pages and counting, 2.5 presidential libraries. That would be the home of the Adams family, so John and John Quincy Adams, and also half of Thomas Jefferson's library. His personal collections are at the MHS. We are free and open to the public, and I encourage everyone to come visit us on Boylston Street in the Fenway to see our new exhibit, which is all about the Declaration of Independence. So we'll go to the first slide. So we'll actually show you a few items that are currently on display in the exhibition, and then we'll move on to some other items that are more closely related to Maine. So the first one here is actually so that you know what's going to happen on Tuesday. There will be a lot of news about this, but Tuesday, 5 days from now, is the 250th anniversary of Evacuation Day. And that is the day when General Howe and the British regulars left Boston, giving George Washington his first military victory and lifting the siege of Boston. And so there'll be some parades. There's been, if you've followed the news, there's been a lot of activity related to the Knox Trail. Henry Knox, bookseller born in Boston, goes to Fort Ticonderoga in 1775 and carries back to liberate Boston, his own hometown, about 60 tons of cannons and artillery. And it is the placement of these guns on Dorchester Heights which leads to the evacuation of Boston. And of course, the city has changed a whole lot right now, but it's useful perhaps looking at this map to see what Boston was like in 1776. It really is a neck of land, a peninsula that juts out into the harbor. All right, so now that we're somewhat situated geographically, let's go to the next slide. And this is actually going to be the 2 drafts of the Declaration of Independence that are currently on display. On the left, you have Thomas Jefferson's handwritten draft of the Declaration of Independence, and on the right, you have John Adams's handwritten draft. We believe that Jefferson showed Adams a copy of this draft before it went to the other members of the Committee of 5 charged by the Continental Congress to draft this document. The other members are Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. And we also believe that this is the copy that John Adams sent to Abigail Adams to have her take a look at what they were working on in Philadelphia. So you're welcome to come down and take a look at these items. There are people who spend their entire careers studying the various copies of the Declaration of Independence, and these early drafts are a really important piece to show how the text evolved over time. Let's go to the next slide. This is an important piece of Massachusetts history. This is Ezekiel Russell's Declaration of Independence. It is printed in Salem by order of the Massachusetts government, by the Council of the Commonwealth at the time. And it gives pretty clear directions on what should be done to it. So it is sent to every single town in Massachusetts. That would, of course, included the District of Maine at the time. And I'll just read what you're supposed to do with it because it comes with directions. quote, ordered that the Declaration of Independence be printed and a copy sent to the ministers of each parish of every denomination within this state, and that they severally be required to read the same to their respective congregations as soon as divine service is ended in the afternoon on the first Lord's Day after they shall have received it. And after such publication thereof, to deliver the said declaration to the clerks of their several towns or districts, who are hereby required to record the same in their respective town or district books, there to remain as a perpetual memorial thereof. So I'm very curious if there are copies of these that have survived in towns all across Massachusetts and in Maine. If you do find one, I'd be curious to know if it is still in good order and in your collections. All right, let's go to the next slide. And this is a letter from Abigail Adams to her partner, her husband, John Adams. The date is the 21st of July, 1776. She wrote to her, quote, dearest friend, John, who is then in Philadelphia. And Abigail recalled that on the previous Thursday, the 18th of July, she, quote, went with the multitude into King Street to hear the proclamation for independence read and proclaimed. Some field pieces, she recalled, with the train were brought there. The troops appeared under arms, and all the inhabitants assembled there. When Colonel Crafts read from the balcony of the State House the proclamation, great attention was given to every word. As soon as he ended, the cry from the balcony was, God save our American states. And then 3 cheers which rended the air. The bells rang, the privateers fired, the forts and batteries, the cannon were discharged, the platoons followed, and every face appeared joyful. So that's her witnessing the first reading, public reading of the Declaration of Independence in Boston. She then noted that James Bowdoin, go you Bears, president of the Executive Council for the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, made some remarks there. Then after dinner, quote, the king's arms were taken down from the State House, and every vestige of him from every place in which it appeared, and burnt in King Street. So that, thus, she concluded, ends royal authority in this state, and all the people shall say amen. And so those are her recollections of hearing the Declaration read for the first time. Her voice and her presence are certainly not out of place when we think of the period of the American Revolution. She's such an important figure. But this letter, if you know anything about the Adams family, this letter is unusual in one key way. And the circumstances that surround it certainly need to be mentioned to provide a complete picture of the moment as well. What is unusual about the letter is the fact that it was written from Boston. The Adamses did not reside in Boston. What was Abigail Adams doing there? She had not come to Boston to hear the reading or any special occasion related to the revolution then in progress. Rather, she was in Boston, present for this event, because she was there on other business. So let me read you the full opening paragraphs of this letter. So we'll go to the next slide. And as I do, note that Abigail and John had nicknames for each other. She was Portia, or Diana, and he was Lysander. July 21, 1776, Boston. So this is the start of the letter. I have no doubt but that my dearest friend is anxious to know how his Portia does, and his little flock of children under the operation of disease once so formidable. I have the pleasure to tell him that they are all comfortable, though some of them complaining. Nabby has been very ill, but the eruption begins to make its appearance upon her and upon Johnny. Tommy is so well that the doctor inoculated him again today, fearing it had not taken. Charlie has no complaints yet, though his arm has been very sore. Further down in the letter, when she describes the people assembled to hear the reading of the Declaration, she also made note that, quote, the smallpox prevented many thousand from the country. So perhaps under different circumstances, Abigail Adams might have brought her children to Boston to specifically hear the reading of the Declaration of American Independence, something that may have drawn a larger crowd to Boston. At that point in time, however, Boston was shut off from the rest of the world. As the people on King Street wandered back to their dwellings after that eventful day on the 18th of July when they heard the reading of the Declaration, their minds were probably attempting to pierce the veil of the future to see what this new nation might bring. Their thoughts perhaps returned to the grim reality that they were all confined to this peninsula in Boston Harbor until this pestilence that had befallen them could be tamed. Thus, over this politically joyous and definitely anxious occasion, there was also something that dimmed and partially obstructed the light of celebration. So you need to think about this context as to why or how Bostonians and a lot of people in the Bay State are experiencing this time. All right, let's go to the next slide. Now, this is the front cover of one of the newspapers that printed the text of the Declaration of Independence in full in Boston. So next slide, please. So this is the front page of the edition, which came out on the 18th of July. You see that this one, it's blocked off. That's why I showed you the earlier one so you could see the masthead. But this is the actual edition that came out on the 18th of July in 1776. The same day that Abigail Adams heard the document itself read from the balcony of the old State House. Now, people may have read the words on here with some excitement, with some trepidation, but some people may have wondered what would actually change under a new government. You see, if a person read to the next few pages, click please, they would find something that is perhaps jarring to us now. One more click. On one of the pages inside this very document, this very newspaper that is proclaiming American independence to the world, there is an advertisement for a runaway enslaved person. Independence. But independence for whom? And from whom? Some people at the time, like Abigail Adams, would have been upset by this too. So again, the light of this moment when America declared itself a new nation was seemingly darkened, blocked by a stain, by the original sin of slavery. These words printed on the same document that shared the news of American freedom with its readers. For decades, for generations more, American independence was nothing more than a hypocrisy to those who remain enslaved. And it was not a new dawn that greeted them on Independence Day, 1776. Theirs was still very much an American experience shrouded in seemingly endless darkness. So let's leave Boston and Massachusetts and go up to the District of Maine for some Maine-specific items. This one is just from the time period. I thought it might be of interest to folks who live in Harpswell. It is a tax assessment letter from 1776-77 from Harpswell to the Honorable Henry Gardner, Esquire of Boston. We, the subscribers, assessors of the town of Harpswell, have assessed the inhabitants of this town with their estates to the amount of £245, 9 shillings and 4 pence, whereof Paul Prendle, constable, is to collect £168, 4 shillings and 5 pence, and Mark Prisley, constable, is to collect £77, 4 shillings and 11 pence, it being for the year 1776, in observance of a warrant from the Honorable Henry Gardner, Esquire. Harpswell, March 15th, 1777. Something local right there. All right, let's go to the next one. And this takes us further north. This is from the collection that consists of a proclamation issued by a Colonel John Allen while the commanding officer at Machias on the 23rd of June. He's encouraging men to enlist with the Continental Army. And the proclamation outlines British persecutions and details Native American participation in this as well. It's a rather lengthy proclamation. I'm just going to read you the first 2 paragraphs of it. Listen to how they're writing. No one writes about this way anymore. All right, here's Colonel Allen. Quote, whereas a number of troops with several ships of war belonging to the British King now in open war with the United States of America have invaded the eastern part of the state of Massachusetts Bay, Taking the advantage of the indigent state of this country, and encouraged by a number of venal wretches and sycophants who have been perpetually lurking within the bowels of this persecuted country, using that deception, an art with which they are so conspicuous, thinking by this means to overcome the quiet and peaceable inhabitants by caresses and promised indulgence, in order to cut off and subjugate a great part of this country and bring them under the arbitrary government of Britain. And whereas by repeated abuses of such promises, which the inhabitants of this continent have experienced during this war, should convince every rational mind what they must expect by giving up tamely their all into the hands of such beings, and that nothing else is intended but to wrench from this free country all that is dear, humane, and sacred. Still, some who are actuated from principles of fear, attachment to Britain's self, and other lucrative views seem willingly to comply themselves and endeavor to lead others into the same snare. Therefore, to prevent the bloody and horrid designs of our enemy, whose tenderest mercies are cruelty, I do hereby promise all persons whatever who will join the troops in the service of the United States for the defense of the Eastern country every encouragement given to the troops in the Continental service. So he goes on, and we'll go to the next slide. He goes on for quite some time, but I do like the signature given under my hand at Machias, June the 23rd, 1779, and in the third year of American independence. And then I'm going to end with this document, which I think is very quickly becoming one of my favorite ones in the vast collections of the Massachusetts Historical Society. This is the diary of an expedition to observe the solar eclipse in Penobscot Bay, Maine, in October of 1780. It's written by a fellow by the name of John Davis, who was joining this expedition led by a Harvard professor named Samuel Williams. And what I like about this, first off, there's a lot of detail in here. What I like about this is that it tells us, it reminds us that this is the era of the Enlightenment, that these individuals are scientists and they are behind British lines. They need permission to go behind British lines to observe this solar eclipse. And the idea that what happens on Earth, the bickering of men and politicians and warfare, is nothing compared to this greater good of understanding the heavens and where we stand among the stars, is just such an Enlightenment idea and goal. I think it really shines through in this. So I'll just read you a few passages from this diary, which is not too long, but let's start with the 18th of October here in 1780. So the crew arrives in Penobscot Bay. They're not allowed to land. The British forces who control Fort George say they seem as unwilling to suppose us so harmless as we declare ourselves. They object to them landing, and it says, and then Davis continues on to say, it is no compliment, I think, to the boasted rationality, the good sense, and the liberality of man, that such should be the regulations established, such as to prevent a company of harmless astronomers from using their instruments of science and of peace, and from observing the darkness as well as the light of the sun, which the more benevolent author of the universe has made common to all. On the 19th of October, he talks about finally being allowed to land, staying with a landlord in someone's barn. This is an individual who has done very well, but the war has separated him from his Western friends, and he feels very torn about his loyalties to the United States and to Great Britain. So this gives you a sense of how people on the ground are feeling, torn between these two sides in this conflict. And then on the 21st of October in 1780, he writes about Captain Mowat. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. This is the fellow who burned Falmouth. Captain Mowat receives us on board the Albany with great politeness. The lieutenant and doctor of the ship and a number of the officers from the forts favor us with their company at dinner. The table was plentiful and elegantly furnished, and the wine was handed round briskly. The heart grew warm, the affections all played kindly. The unsocial passions were all asleep, all animosity was buried, and an hour of sociability converted enemies to friends. So these are American astronomers on board a British vessel of war, and they're drinking and breaking bread together. Quote, if the contending powers of the earth could thus amicably assemble, banish each hateful feeling from their bosoms, and forgetting all distinction of party, consider themselves merely as men and as brethren, reason and benevolence would soon do their perfect work. The din of arms, the sound of war would torture our ears no more. Innocence would meet with protection, merit with encouragement, peace and plenty would furnish all their blessings, and all the pleasing fictions of the golden age be realized. And then the day of the eclipse, the 27th of October in 1780, a Friday. Next slide, please. And this is a drawing of Penobscot Bay where they witnessed this. 5 of the company were furnished with telescopes for observation. A few minutes before 11, we sit down to the instruments. The seconds are counted and the minutes pronounced as they advanced. All the inhabitants of the island, a simple, undesigned assembly, had collected upon the occasion. All was expectation and suspense. The initial moment at length arrives, and soon after 11, the shadow is observed to touch the western limb of the sun. The eclipse was nearly total. Objects cast no perceptible shadow. Venus appeared bright in the west. Several of the fixed stars were seen. The air grew sensibly colder, and Fahrenheit's thermometer fell 3.5 degrees, and an hour after the eclipse was over, it had risen 9 degrees. The increase of light was much more rapid than that of darkness, but that of heat and cold in the same proportion. The shadow, to appearance as in reality, went off faster than it came on. The increase of light was much more rapid than that of darkness. I love that line, and I'd like to think that the people for whom independence meant nothing because they were enslaved, or meant something else because there was much more going on than just the attempt to create a new nation, or to all the people in all of American history, 250 years to this day, who have not always felt that the rays of light of the promise of independence have reached them, that there was something that darkened that. It's probably useful for them to remember that the increase of light was much more rapid than that of darkness. Thank you very much, and over to you, Larissa.
Well, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Kanisorn, for that. And we are going to now move to Maine Historical Society and Kathleen Neumann. And I will share her slideshow. Okay.
Thank you, Larissa, and to the Pejepscot History Center for having us today. So I'm going to share with you some things that are in the Maine Historical Society's collections, revolutionary related artifacts. A lot of these are on display now in our newest exhibit, Pathways to Freedom, Stories from Maine and the American Revolution, which is open now and going to be open through the end of the calendar year. So some of these are things that you can see on display right now, but all of them are artifacts that live in the MHS collections. And so anyone who comes here to do research is welcome to look at them up close and personal. So I'm going to start, we'll start at the top with the Dunlap broadside. Also, these are all objects that you can see digitally on Maine Memory Network, which is our digital database and archive. So I've included on each slide the Maine Memory Network number. So if you want to see it tonight online for yourself and kind of look up close, just you go to mainmemory.net, enter that number, and it'll take you right to the artifact. So the Dunlap broadside. This is a really precious and really rare piece. On July 4th, 1776, after the Second Continental Congress voted to adopt the Declaration of Independence, that committee that Kanisorn had mentioned, that committee of five that had been charged with writing it, were now charged with making sure it got printed. So they went to the Congress's official printer, John Dunlap, and he probably printed about 200 of these. So these are the oldest printed copies of the Declaration of Independence that exist. Again, probably 200 made originally. There are only 26 that have been authenticated that are known to exist, and this is one of the 26, and it's in the collections of Maine Historical Society. This rare piece is on display in our Pathways exhibit, and it will be through July 4th, and then it's going to go on tour to all the 16 counties in Maine. So it may be coming to your hometown. So if you want to know where it's going and when it's going to be there and for how long, I just shared in the chat the link to our Revolutionary Maine website, and you can see all the tour dates there, as well as all of our other revolutionary programming content, and collections are featured there too. Next slide, please. So this also mentioned earlier, the burning of Falmouth. This is an illustration of what happened that day. So not too long after the first shots of the war are fired at Lexington and Concord, here in October, so where I'm sitting, what is today Portland and what was then Falmouth, the town was attacked by Captain Mowat, who had sort of been charged to kind of go up and down the New England coast, kind of teaching a lesson to towns that were causing trouble, that were rebelling against the king. And one of the towns that he stopped at was Falmouth or Portland. Essentially leveled the city, left it uninhabited, burned to the ground. That's what you see that's happening in the image here. This moment is actually mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. So much of the Declaration of Independence is a list of 27 things that the king has done, the grievances that we're not super thrilled with. One of them is he has burned our towns. This is the moment that they're talking about. So this moment is actually mentioned in the Declaration and served as a real rallying point at the beginning of the war, for support and sympathy on both sides of the Atlantic. Next slide, please. This is a letter from Benedict Arnold to Samuel Chase. So one of the things that we've done in our exhibit, and that we're doing throughout the semi-quincentennial commemoration, is sort of acknowledging like the four major moments in Maine that are tied to the Revolution. The burning of Falmouth is one, and this is one of the others. Unfortunately, a lot of those moments are kind of tragic and not very successful moments for the Patriots, and this is one of them. So Benedict Arnold, in the fall of 1775, leads about 1,100 Continental soldiers from Cambridge, Massachusetts, up through the Maine wilderness to Quebec, with the idea that they're going to attack Canada and hopefully get the British out of there and away from New England. It's not a great trip. If you know anything about like the fall and the winter in Maine, the weather is not super cooperative. They face a lot of disease, a lot of hunger. About half of those men that are traveling with Arnold turned back, desert, or died before they got to Canada. They get to Quebec in November, where they join up with Richard Montgomery and his troops. The attack on Quebec takes place on December 31st. Montgomery is killed in the fighting, and it's not a win for the Patriots. This is not a successful mission, but it is a real one of those moments that it's a real test of fortitude of the Patriots. This is a letter that Benedict Arnold writes couple of years later to Samuel Chase, and he's talking about the revolution, the movement of the troops and their need for supplies in the letter. Good question. Someone's asking, did Arnold write this or was it done by a secretary? I think it could go either way. The handwriting is really neat, so a secretary might be a safe bet with just Arnold's signature. What we do have in Arnold's own hand, though, and that you can see in the exhibit, is his letter book from his expedition. So all the letters that he was writing, he would write a copy of and would during the expedition and keep in this letter book. And we have that letter book in our collections that was left to us through an arrangement actually made by Aaron Burr. And you can see it on display when you come to visit. Next slide, please. One of the other unfortunate moments in Maine and in the story of the Revolution is the Penobscot expedition. And this gentleman played quite a role in that expedition. So this is the silhouette there, and the letter here was written by Peleg Wadsworth. He was a general during the American Revolution, and folks in Maine might recognize that name because he's the grandfather of the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He was second in command of the ground troops at the Penobscot expedition, which was this huge military undertaking to, again, try and get the British out of Fort George in Castine, Maine, out of that area. They're really interested in this area strategically as for its natural resources, and they're trying to set like a foothold here to make it potentially a colony for loyalists that they're referring to as like New Ireland. So you have like this huge fleet of ships that come in and all these ground troops that come in, and the Americans get within striking distance of the fort, but then they just kind of stop. And there's sort of this stalemate and kind of a bit of a power struggle with the troops on the land, not eager to attack the fort until they do something about the ships in the harbor. And the general in charge of like the ships in the harbor says, I'm not going to do anything about these ships until you get the fort. So because they're stalling, that gives the British time to send in reinforcements. British fleet comes in and wipes out the American fleet. It is the worst naval disaster in American history until Pearl Harbor. And this General Peleg Wadsworth, he was there, actually kind of is the only real guy in charge that will leave with something of an enhanced reputation because of his actions during the Penobscot expedition. And this is a letter that he's written to his wife, Elizabeth. One of the things that I really like about Peleg's letters to Elizabeth is he really gives her like a lot of details. He really tells her like what's going on, what they're doing, what's happening. And he talks about how they've lost a lot of ground and we're facing an enemy that's really a lot stronger than us. And we also know too that she's following him with their children throughout much of the war. They were both from Massachusetts, from like the Plymouth area. And she's following him as he kind of makes his way through Massachusetts and through Maine. And this letter is one that he writes during the Penobscot expedition. Next slide, please. This is a letter by another soldier, a William Bailey, who's writing to his mom. We have a lot of letters that he wrote to his mom during the war. He was from Falmouth. We don't know a ton about William Bailey. He's a young man from Falmouth or from Portland, who had an apprenticeship in 1774, but a couple years into it, he bails, he leaves. And joins the Continental Army. And throughout the war, he's writing to his mom. He writes to her about military life, a lot about how like the poverty of the common soldier, that they're not getting paid, that they don't have the supplies that they need. He says he can't come home yet. You get the impression that she's constantly asking him, when are you coming home? That she's afraid for him and she wants him to come home. And he keeps telling her that he can't leave. Um, Peleg Wadsworth and William Bailey are two of the stories that we follow really closely in our exhibit. Again, the exhibit's called Pathways to Freedom. So we've identified 6 individuals who actually lived and were involved in the war in Maine. And then we're calling them our pathfinders. How did these people find their way to freedom and independence during the conflict? And Peleg Wadsworth and William Bailey are 2 of them. Next slide, please. One of the other pathfinders, this name might be familiar to Mainers, is Molly Oggett or Molly Ockett, who was an indigenous woman who's living in Maine, kind of traveling between the Bethel area and Quebec, selling goods. She's today we'd probably say like doctor or healer, doctress is the word that they used back then. And this is a purse that was made from wool that she made. Or wool, porcupine quill, and hemp. And again, on display in our exhibit right now. And her story is a really interesting reminder and an interesting look at how did indigenous people face and kind of survive and map their way through this conflict. Next slide, please. And this last one, this is another really special piece, a lock of George Washington's hair. So when George Washington died in 1799, something really interesting happens where like the whole country kind of goes into mourning, which was not really something that was done. You wouldn't typically like mourn like a political figure or someone that you didn't know personally. You wouldn't mourn personally. But George Washington was such a figure. I mean, he himself is kind of like a symbol of the young nation. So when he dies, a lot of people take that as a real personal loss, and they're looking for ways to remember and memorialize him. One of these individuals is Peleg Wadsworth's daughter, Elizabeth. She knows that her father had known George Washington during the war. So she asks her father, I'd really like something to remember him by, a sample of his handwriting or a lock of his hair, if he had any hair. She asked them, did Washington have any hair? And he did. I think he was actually pretty proud of the fact that he didn't wear a wig. You saw his natural hair. So Peleg makes the request to Martha Washington, this is my daughter really admired your husband. This is something she'd really like to have. And so through her late husband's secretary, Mrs. Washington obliges and she sends this lock of her husband's hair to Elizabeth Wadsworth here in Maine. Elizabeth died really young, just a couple years later, and she left the lock of hair to her sister Zilpah. And Zilpah, when she dies, leaves it to her son Henry, the poet, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He has it placed in this lovely little locket for safekeeping, and that's the engraving that you see there on the left of the locket. Just sort of noting this is Washington's hair, and it was given to Eliza in 1800, and the locket is made in 1850. And this is, I think, a really poignant reminder of how people remembered and memorialized the revolution. Henry Longfellow certainly played a major role in how we imagine the people of the American Revolution through his poems like Paul Revere's Ride. He really helped to give us an image of ourselves, who we were as a young country, that still has a lot of influence on how we remember our history today. So I hope that you folks can come make your way down to Portland to come and see some of these pieces in person. If now is not a good time to see them in person, then jump on Maine Memory Network and you can check them out digitally. But yeah, we've got a lot of great things planned for this special year, including that exhibit. So check out our Revolutionary Maine website, and I hope we can share more of those stories with you in the time to come. Thanks very much.
That was fantastic, Kathleen. And I did not do my moderator's duties by giving you your proper introduction. So I just want to say now a few things that Kathleen's wonderful, and I'm especially pleased to have her tonight because when I worked at Maine Historical Society, I had the great privilege of hiring her at Maine Historical. And Kathleen heads up the Education and Public Programs Department there, including overseeing the Longfellow House. So, of course, there's lots of Longfellow history based there. Um, but prior to that, she was a social studies teacher in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And this is a fun connection to earlier when we were hearing about John Adams. Kathleen was also a longtime seasonal Park Service guide at the John and Abigail Adams National Park and their house. So, sorry I didn't do that on the front end for you, but
It's quite all right.
there we go. All right, we are going to wrap up. Oh, and I do want to say one other thing, and that is that you showed items that were related to the Penobscot expedition and Benedict Arnold's ill-fated Portage North
West, yes.
attempt. And we, Topsom sent a regiment to the Penobscot expedition, believe it or not. We did have folks go from Topsom, and both Topsom and Brunswick were involved. There were men from Topsom and Brunswick involved in Benedict Arnold's that journey as well. So lots of connections there. Okay, to round out the evening with our own highlights from Pejepscot History Center is Robin Davis. She's the manager of collections and research. Robin is an art history graduate from USM, and she has worked at the Osher Map Library as a collections assistant, where she also has curated several exhibits. And she also worked at the Wilson Museum in Castine. And during her degree program, interned at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. She's brought a lot of wonderful things to the organization and is a great person to have overseeing our collection. So I will share her. Let's make sure I have it on here. Kathleen's. Give me 1 second. Make sure I have it in the right place here. All right. Oops. Sorry about that. There we go.
Alrighty. Well, thanks for that lovely introduction, Larissa, and thank you all for being here. It's been wonderful to see everything from the other collections, and I'm excited to share what we have. So I'm going to start out with our British side drum, circa 1770. We don't know exactly when it was made, but sometime around then. And this drum was captured during the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775 in Charlestown, Massachusetts, and was donated to PHC in 1995. The Harpswell sea captain, Walter Merriman, bought it for 50 cents sometime before his death in 1791. It then descended through his family and was used by his great-great-great-grandson, Andrew Alexander, in the Civil War when he served in the 20th Maine Regiment. And we also have a flintlock musket that was in the same family, also used in the American Revolution. So the drum is decorated with the British coat of arms and the monarchy's mottos. One is in French, and it translates to God and my right, and the other reads, shame to him who thinks evil of it, in Anglo-Norman. In 1714, George I, former elector of Hanover, I should say, became King of Great Britain, and you can see in the right-hand photo, in the bottom right of that is the sort of the quarter of the coat of arms was changed to reflect his titles. And 3 territories or duchies are represented there, one of them being Brunswick. and that is the little sort of two lions that look like they're jumping. So those represent Brunswick, which is kind of a fun detail that we recently discovered. So the drums, ropes, and leather pieces, and perhaps the calfskin heads were probably replaced over time. The leather pieces called tugs or tuning ears are slid up and down to change tension on the heads. And it wasn't uncommon for drums like this to be repurposed for different conflicts, but this drum leaves us with some kind of unanswered, intriguing questions. Who had it right after it was captured? Who brought it to Maine? Where and when and why did Walter Merriman buy it? And also, why was the coat of arms not maybe painted over when it was used in the Civil War? Maybe it just seemed unnecessary, or perhaps they were proud of its history as it was. But it's a really wonderful piece that we're very excited to share in our upcoming exhibit. So please all come see it. So next slide, please. So this is a diary of a young man named Barstow Sylvester, who served in the Continental Army and was stationed in or near Tiverton, or Tiverton, I should say, Rhode Island in the spring of 1777. And he kept this journal between February and May, and it chronicles his journey from from Maine down to Rhode Island and back again, and what he did there. And Barstow was born in 1757 in Hanover, Massachusetts, and his family moved to Harpswell in 1762. And their house was on the lot, which was later where Reverend Elijah Kellogg built his house. So the first couple of entries, which you can see in the right-hand side of the left-hand photo, covers his journey down to Rhode Island. And between December of 1776 and October of 1779, the British Army occupied the island, then called Rhode Island, but is now called Aquidneck Island, just off of Tiverton. And it was a mustering place for colonial troops gathering to drive out the British. Many famous names were stationed there at various times, including Paul Revere, John Hancock, Marquis de Lafayette, and others. So one of his first entries reads, Monday went on a raid. And later that night, he writes that the quote, Royals went down the river and fired several shots and drew the regulars out of their lodges in these barracks. And later that week, he writes about his fellow soldiers going on to Rhode Island and firing on the British. There was another skirmish the next day in which several colonial soldiers were killed. And at Howland's Ferry, the British, quote, split one of our guns and wounded 5 men. On March 5th, he writes, nothing remarkable at present, but our men went on Rhode Island about midnight and drove the sentries away. Much of this journal is really just a description of how cold and stormy and unwholesome the weather was while he was there. Apart from the first raid, it appears that he was mostly just on guard, and he actually got sick at one point and wasn't able to go on guard that night. And on March 27th, he reports that the captain and lieutenants got quite groggy, which you can imagine. And then on April 6th, he set out for Hanover, Massachusetts, where he was from originally. He stayed with some family members and went on to Boston to collect his wages. And then by May 9th, he was back in Harpswell, where he reported nothing remarkable at present, but foul weather and very wet. And I haven't been able to find any other records of his military service. He kind of missed some of the biggest, engagements in like the Battle of Rhode Island. And he returned to Maine. He married Rosanna Jordan of Brunswick, and they had at least 9 children together. I think it's a really interesting piece, as it gives us an on-the-ground account of a military service in action. But the majority of the entries are really just about how nothing remarkable happened that day and that the weather was really bad. And we don't learn a lot about him as a person, but it does point us to some realities of life in the 18th century. I think his constant descriptions of the weather remind us of the impact that it had on daily life for them, comfort and well-being, travel, work, access to resources. And all of these would have been true, especially in Harpswell as a small, remote and rural town. All right, next slide. Keeping an eye on the time here. I don't know, I'll just go for it. And so this is William Owen's ledger, sort of store ledger, kept between 1774 and 1796, and it contains the accounts of William Owen of Brunswick, and it's an absolute treasure trove of information about life in the 18th century in Pejepscot. He was a furniture maker, but like many people at the time, had several occupations. He owned real estate, lodging, meals, drink. He sold nails and tobacco, coffee, salt and pepper, indigo, cloth, like you name it, he sold it. And he also loaned money, kept a stable, and alcohol sales made up a very big part of his income. And he sold many different types. So that appears a lot in here. There are quite a few familiar names in here, including Barstow Sylvester, who we just heard about. He paid for coffee delivered to his father in 1775, and he's on the left-hand page. He's the fourth entry down. You can see his name there. As it was partially a barter economy, customers paid off their debts to Owen with food and goods and labor and just about anything in addition to money. In 1780, someone paid their debt by, quote, a miserable poor horse cart. And also other parts of the economy appear as well, like fur trading, mentions of weavers and spinners in the town. And also you can track how inflation impacted the local economy. In 1776, 1 pound of tobacco was 6 shillings 6 pence. And by May of 78, it was 1 pound of tobacco was 18 shillings. There are also several references to Black residents, including Anthony Griffin. Owen built him a drawers, a bed, and a table in 1778. On August 22nd of that same year, Owen delivered 13 buttons to Quash Winshaw, who was a formerly enslaved man living in Topsham. And the impact of the ongoing war is reflected here as well. In 1776, Colonel Finney and at least some of his regiment boarded at Owen's, and he supplied them, sent them on their way. And then on July 10th of 76, Isaac Doane signed a promissory note to Owen, which read, "Then hired half a house in Falmouth belonging to William Owen, which I promised to pay for at the rate of 10 guineas per year from the above date. But in case I am disturbed by reason of the enemy coming into the harbor, then to pay at the rate of 10 pound lawful money and to pay quarterly." So I guess we're just about at time, Larissa. So
Robin, I would keep what more do you have for us? I would go ahead.
yeah, okay. Well, I'm happy to keep going. We have 2 more.
Yeah.
So this letter is a really interesting piece that I came across while I was preparing for this presentation. We didn't have a lot of research on it, but I had a feeling that it would be worth digging into. It had some interesting names, and I was curious about it. So I know his handwriting is a little hard to read, so I'll just read it to you quickly. And it's written by a man named Jeremiah Pote. He is writing to Captain Thomas Wilson of Topsham. And he says, "Dear Sir, I've seen Mr. Pagan and shew him the letter you left with me in presence of the lieutenant, the schooner your son was wounded on board. They tell me that the doctor's bill and funeral charges and board while sick overrun his share of prize money by 6 pound or more. And that is all I can learn. Who am with respects your humble friend and servant, Jeremiah Pote." So the Mr. Pagan mentioned in the letter was Robert Pagan, or perhaps one of his brothers, and Jeremiah Pote was his son-in-law. Pagan was a prominent and wealthy merchant in Falmouth, present-day Portland, as was Pote, and both men's businesses were destroyed in the burning of Falmouth. And they were both staunch loyalists. And Pagan was actually tarred and feathered at one point. After the burning, they both eventually ended up in Castine, which was sort of a haven for loyalists time. And you can see the letters addressed from Fort George, which was at Castine. And their businesses flourished there. They were shipbuilders. They owned a lot of vessels that were trading with England, sailing all around, but they also owned a fleet of privateers. And these were privately owned ships that were sort of working for the British government that could attack American ships and take them as prizes. And remember the mention of prize in the letter. So I was kind of curious to know what their connection was to this man in Topsham. And as it turns out, one of Thomas Wilson's sons had run off to sea and was never heard from again. And he was also rumored to be a loyalist. So it appears that this son was sailing in one of Pagan's privateers when he was killed. And you can imagine what it must have been like receiving a letter like this. I don't know if this was the death notification or not, but also being sort of expected to then potentially pay this fee of £6, which in today's money is quite a lot. And as far as I know, Thomas Wilson was not a loyalist as well. So it's kind of interesting reminder that even in wartime, business was business to some extent, for a lot of people, and even across lines of allegiance. And even in towns as small as Brunswick and Harpswell and Topsham, feelings about the fight for independence were not universal. And I think that is illustrated well here and also in our next and final item. All right, so this is a deed from Samuel Thompson to James Purinton for land in Topsham. And I'm mostly going to be talking about Samuel Thompson just as a very interesting, controversial figure in Brunswick history. He was born in 1735 and lived in Brunswick and Topsham. He was a delegate to the Provincial Congress, later the Continental Congress, and around 1774, he was appointed Lieutenant Colonel of the militia, and by 76 was a Brigadier General of the Cumberland troops. He had a reputation as a firebrand and loyalizer, and was not universally popular even among the patriots. He launched several personal campaigns against local loyalists, and at a Brunswick town meeting in June of 75, the crowd who had assembled for the meeting, led by Thompson, became so excited that they grabbed the prominent loyalist Vincent Woodside and tried to get him to renounce the crown. He wouldn't do that, and so they ended up burying him alive. But he was rescued in time by some people who came to save him, so he was not killed, but certainly traumatized. And in May of 1775, Thompson and other local men captured Henry Mallet, who we've heard about already tonight, in Falmouth in what is known as Thompson's War. They soon released him, but as we know, Mallet returned 5 months later and burned Falmouth. So that certainly was a controversial move on Thompson's part. He was relatively wealthy and worth over $35,000 at the time of his death. He was a tavern owner and also owned a considerable amount of land, like this lot in Topsham along the Cathins River, that he sold to his brother-in-law, James Purinton. And Purinton was also in the military. He was a lieutenant and also a staunch supporter of the Republican Constitution. So taken all together, I think these items are representative of many different lived experiences. They offer a window into what life was like for individuals from the three towns, how this time was shaped by conflict, and how in many ways, life sort of went on as usual. They're buying and selling land, they're needing to buy food and continue their businesses. And while choosing these items, I was reminded of how important these types of collections are. They hold so many interesting stories that are just sort of waiting to be pieced together to create the larger picture. So that's it for me.
That was great. And I just want to, say before we open for questions, how wonderful it was that all three of you had pieces that spoke to each other in one way or another. And just so that everybody knows, they all picked their pieces independently. There was not a, we kind of put the list together at the end, and it all kind of worked, but they all chose them independently. So it just goes to show how close all of these places were. I mean, we were obviously part of Massachusetts, but how the region was really all very, very connected. I want to thank all of our panelists, and I think we do have a few things in the chat. I do want to point out, thank you to Joe Southard, our trustee, who reminded me that and everybody that our colonial tea is actually March 29th, not March 28th, like I said. So sorry about that. I know somebody asked how long the 2 written copies of the Declaration of Independence are on display for, and Kathleen, can you just point out how long that exhibit is up?
Well, I think that was a question for Massachusetts Historical Society. Because I think there were, correct me if I'm wrong, but he mentioned the copies that Jefferson and Adams both wrote. Yes, so I think they're talking about those.
So those should be up through the end of the calendar year. So you have till December 19th to make it to Boston.
Great. And
the Dunlap broadside will be at MHS through July 4th. And then going on tour, and Brunswick is going to be the last stop on the tour. It'll be at Bowdoin College of Art, October.
Yes. And we are likely we're working on having a talk by Dr. Liam Riordan, who is the chair of the history department at University of Maine, Orono, and he's going to talk about what 1776 means to us today. That will be sometime in October, around when the Dunlap is in Brunswick. So that'll be really exciting, and you will hear more about that. I think, Kathleen, you answered the question regarding the letter by Benedict Arnold, whether that was in his hand or transcribed by a secretary.
I don't know for sure, but I think that was a good observation. The handwriting is incredibly neat, which points to probably a secretary. And Arnold certainly would have been likely to have had a secretary writing letters for him that then he just would have signed. So I don't know, but it's probable, maybe even likely.
Somebody in the chat mentioned the book The Fort by Bernard Cornwell. That is an excellent fictionalized but very closely adhering to the history story about the Penobscot expedition. It really is very good. Many years ago at Maine Historical led a discussion on that book, and it is pretty incredible if you want to kind of live that experience. That's kind of a neat way to do it.
Agreed.
Yes. And we have some thank yous and some wonderful presentations, which is great. Arnold's, I'm seeing another message in here. For those who hadn't heard, Arnold's Hospital, built in Maine by Carey Pons, has been found. A metal detector found a perfect rectangle of cut nails matching the dimension of the building. Also found nearby when a tree topped over was a clutch of musket balls that were probably in a leather bag. That is very cool. Excellent. Does anybody else have any questions for any of the speakers tonight? We really are grateful for everybody joining us. This obviously is being recorded and will be sent out to you after the fact. Please share it with whomever you would like to share it with, and stay tuned for the rest of our 250th programming this year, and everything that our 2 state historical societies are doing. And we thank you, and we'll end there for the evening. Have a good evening.
Thank you.